The winter of 1884 arrived in the Wind River High Country the way a verdict arrives without argument, without appeal. At 8,000 feet, the cold did not settle so much as lay siege, pressing its weight against every wall a woman had built, testing every seam she had sealed with her own hands. Cora Haywood woke on the morning of December 15th to find the tin cup on her table frozen through a solid disk of ice, 3 feet from a stove she had fed until midnight. Her breath hung in the cabin air like smoke that would not rise. Frost had crept up the inside of the log walls in fern-shaped sheets, delicate and cruel, growing on the very timber that was supposed to shelter what remained of her family. She lay still for a long moment under quilts stiff with cold, listening to the small sound of her son breathing in the bunk across the room. Eli was 8 years old, and he slept the deep sleep of a child who trusted his mother completely, and that trust was the most terrifying thing Cora Haywood carried. The woodpile outside the door held perhaps 2 weeks of fuel, maybe less if the north wind kept its pace. She did the arithmetic the way she had been doing it every morning since October, and the answer came out the same each time, that the cold was winning and she was running out of ways to fight it. She knew what the cold could do. She had watched it do its worst 11 months before, in this same cabin, in this same February darkness, when Daniel Haywood had lain on that same plank bed with the fever burning through him and the pneumonia filling his lungs with fluid, while the stove in the corner ate wood and gave back almost nothing. She had fed that stove through 3 days and 3 nights without sleeping, and it had not been enough. And Daniel had gone out of the world on a Wednesday morning with Eli pressed against his side, and Cora holding his hand, and the cabin still cold enough to see her breath. The ground had been too frozen to bury him properly until April. She had kept his claim, filed her own papers under the Homestead Act, and stayed because there was nowhere else to go, and because leaving felt like letting the cold win twice. The cabin Daniel had built measured 16 feet by 20 walls, 7 feet high, chinked with mud and creek moss that had cracked and partially fallen through the winter, leaving gaps wide enough in places to feel the wind on the inside. The plank floor sat on joists with open air moving beneath it, and the cold came up through the boards the way cold always found a way through anything that was not stone. In the northwest corner stood the iron stove, a cast iron burner freighted up from Cheyenne the spring before Daniel died, its straight pipe cutting through the roof and pointing at a sky that gave nothing back. The bed where Eli slept was a platform of split pine in the far corner, and every night Cora piled every quilt she owned on the boy and still woke to check that he was breathing. She was not alone in her trouble, though. Being a woman alone with a child made her trouble heavier than most. Half a mile down the valley, Thomas Brennan ran a cabin of 4, with a voice loud enough to carry across the snow and opinions firm enough to bear any weight, and he was burning through wood at a rate that would leave him empty by February. The Curtis place stood a mile east, where Samuel and Mary kept an infant boy whose cough had settled into something wet and rattling, that lived in the perpetual cold damp of a house that never truly warmed. Old Henry Larson, 65 and a widower, watched his roof sag under the weight of snow that no heat ever rose to soften the ridgepole, bending by small degrees toward a catastrophe he could see coming and could not stop. What none of them knew, what Cora had never spoken aloud since she came west, was what she carried from her childhood in the hill country of West Virginia. Her grandfather Elias Reed had been a stonemason, a builder of lime kilns and forged chimneys, who understood fire and rock the way other men understood horses or weather. As a girl, she had followed him through his work sites, handing him stones, mixing his mortar, listening to him explain what he was doing and why, in the slow, patient voice of a man who believed knowledge was the only inheritance worth leaving. Elias had massive, scarred hands and a habit of pressing his palm flat against the warm face of a kiln that had been cold for a day, and he would look at her with his gray eyes, the same gray eyes she saw in her mirror every morning, and say the things she had never forgotten. "Stone doesn't forget heat, girl. Give it enough and it'll pay you back all night long." She had thought of those kilns often since Daniel died. She had lain awake in the January cold, listening to the iron stove tick and cool, and thinking about what her grandfather had built in the Virginia mountains, those great sandstone cones that swallowed a fire and held its warmth for a day after the flames died, that stored heat the way a deep well stores water, giving it back slowly long after the source had gone dry. The iron stove across the room had no such memory. It roared when she fed it and went cold the moment she stopped, and every scrap of warmth it made fled straight up the chimney or leaked through the gaps in the logs. And she was feeding it Daniel's death and her own exhaustion and her son's trust, and getting back almost nothing that lasted through the night. The real enemy was not the cold itself. The real enemy was how fast everything left. Heat made by iron stove rose and vanished and left no trace of itself in any surface of the room. No warmth stored in the walls or the floor or the bed where a child slept. There was no memory in the house. Everything she made, every scrap of warmth she purchased with the wood Daniel had cut, and she had split through the fall, was gone by morning. If she could build something that remembered, something that took the fire's gift and held it through the dark hours, and gave it back when it was needed most, she might survive this country. She might keep her son. She did not speak of it at the monthly gathering the settlers held at the end of January, crowded into Brennan's cabin out of necessity because it was the largest. She had been to enough of these meetings to know that a widow's voice carried a different weight than a man's, in such a room, lighter in the ways that mattered and heavier in the ways that hurt. She listened while the men talked about wood and cold and the inadequacy of their stoves, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap and the knowledge of her grandfather's kilns sitting in her chest like a coal that would not go out. When she finally spoke carefully about stone that stored heat, about a way of building that her grandfather had used in the Virginia mountains, she got as far as a sentence before Brennan's laugh cut across the room. His big hand came down flat on the table with a sound like a rifle shot, and his red beard split around a grin that was almost kind in its certainty. Cora, you've had a hard year, and nobody disputes it. But building in stone wants a mason, not a widow with a boy to feed. You go on home and see to Eli and let the men figure the heating. The room did not quite murmur agreement, but it did not disagree either. The room did not quite murmur. And Samuel Curtis looked at the floor with the particular expression of a man who thinks a thing is wrong, but will not spend the coin to say so. Cora looked at Brennan's grin and at the other faces in the firelight, and felt the familiar weight of a room that had already decided. She gathered her coat. She stepped out into a night so cold the stars seemed to ring like struck metal, and she rode home on a horse that streamed breath into the black air. And she did not waste a moment of that ride on anger, because anger was a luxury she could not afford. She spent it instead on planning. She could not begin until the thaw. The ground was locked, the creek clay sealed under frost, the field stones she needed buried beneath drifts. She would have to survive this winter, the grinding way, the way all of them were surviving it, rationing wood and sleeping in her coat, and rising in the dark to feed the stove just enough to keep Eli warm. But she made herself a promise on that cold ride home, and Cora Haywood did not break promises, having kept harder ones than this in harder circumstances. Come spring, when the earth softened and the talus slopes gave up their snow, she would build the thing Elias Reed had built in the Virginia hills. She would build it alone if she had to, which she probably would, and she would let the next winter speak for her in the language the valley understood, which was survival, and which she intended to speak fluently. The thaw came in March reluctantly, the way everything in that country came on its own terms and no one else's. Cora walked out to the talus slope 2 miles east while snow still lay in the draws, and ran her hands over the field stones scattered there, dense gray rock broken from the mountain's shoulder by 10,000 years of frost and thaw. She had learned from Elias how to read a stone, how to find the ones that would bear the stress of repeated heating without cracking, how to hear the difference in the ring when you struck 2 rocks together. The good stones rang clean. She filled the drag again and again through the long, pale days of March and April. Eli walking beside the horse and handing up stones, she could not quite reach the two of them, working in a silence that was not empty but full of the particular understanding between a mother and a child who have come through something hard together. The clay she found along a bend in the creek, a seam of blue-gray earth that took the print of her thumb and held it, that worked plastic underwater and dried to a hardness near brick. She brought Eli to the deposit and showed him how to test it, pressing his small thumb into the wet surface, watching the impression hold its shape. He looked up at her with the gray eyes he had inherited from her side of the family, Daniel's jaw and her grandfather's eyes, and he did not ask whether the plan would work. He asked how much they needed. She told him, and he went to work with his tin pail, and watching him dig with the solemn industry of a child who understands that this is not a game, Cora felt something in her chest that was not grief and not hope, but lived in the country between them. The digging began in early April, before the last frost had fully quit the ground. She pried up a section of the plank floor with a crowbar the nails screaming free of the joists, and set the boards against the wall. Beneath them, the bare earth lay dark and half-frozen, and she broke it with the spade, cutting a rectangular pit 8 feet long by 4 feet wide, sinking 18 inches until she struck the firm, undisturbed ground that would carry what she meant to build. Each load of earth she lifted felt like a declaration, a woman tearing open her own floor with the faith that what she would set in its place would be worth the wound. She mixed the first mortar in a wooden trough, 3 parts blue clay to 1 part sand, and chopped straw for binding, and spent most of a morning finding the right consistency before her hands settled into a knowledge that felt older than her own experience, as though Elias's hands were working through hers across the years. When the mortar held its shape on the trowel without running, she began to lay the firebox, the largest flat stones first. Built into a chamber 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep, with an arched mouth 14 inches across, deliberately narrower than the chamber behind it, because her grandfather had taught her that a pinched throat draws harder than a lazy wide one, and a hard draw means a hot fire means heat driven deep into the stone, rather than carried uselessly up the chimney. The flue was the genius of the whole design, the place where her grandfather's knowledge departed from everything the valley's homesteaders had ever attempted. A common chimney let the hot gases rush straight up and out, spending their warmth on the open air. She meant instead to make them work for their escape. From the back of the firebox, she laid a channel that ran horizontally along the base of the structure for 6 feet, then rose vertically, then doubled back in the opposite direction. An S-shaped labyrinth winding through the heart of the growing stone mass. Every foot of that path was a foot along which the hot gases would press their heat into the surrounding rock before she permitted them to leave. She formed each channel roughly 6 inches square, building the floors and walls and ceilings of each passage, from flat stone laid in careful courses, smoothing the inner surfaces so that the draft could move cleanly and the creosote would find no rough edge to cling to. Eli helped in the ways an 8-year-old could help, which was more than most people would have credited. He mixed mortar in the small trough she made for him, carrying it to her in a tin pail, steadying stones while she set them fetching water from the creek when she needed to thin a batch. He did not complain and did not ask when it would be done. Once, when she was fitting a particularly stubborn stone into a channel wall and swearing under her breath in the way she only permitted herself when she thought no one was listening, he appeared at her elbow with a flat-faced stone that fit the gap better than the one she had been forcing. She looked at it and looked at him, and he shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a child pretending not to be pleased with himself. She set his stone and said nothing, and he went back to his mortar trough. And it was one of the moments she knew she would carry to the end of her life. The sleeping platform was the most radical thing she built, the element that would have drawn the most laughter from Brennan if he had been watching, which he was not, because he had decided the widow's project was beneath further notice. She extended the upper masonry beyond the firebox into a broad flat shelf 6 feet long by 3 feet wide, laid directly over the horizontal flue channels so that only 4 inches of stone separated the surface from the hot gases flowing beneath. She would not build a bed frame. She would build the bed into the fire itself, and the fire would remember through the night what the morning would need. She chose the capstones with the same care she had given the firebox stones, hunting the talus for the broad flat slabs, wrestling each one home on the drag, with Eli's help and her own considerable stubbornness, levering them into place with a pry pole, and the patience of someone who has run out of alternatives and found, at the bottom of that emptiness, a kind of freedom. The clay mortar fought her the way anything worth building fights the person trying to build it. Pure clay cracked as it dried, opening her careful airtight joints into leaks. She tried more sand and got crumble. She tried more straw and lost smoothness. Night after night, she sat with Elias's notebook, the one he had pressed on Daniel the day they left Pennsylvania, and which Daniel had given to her to keep because she was the one who would know how to use it. And she hunted the margins for the recipe the old man had written in his cramped hand. She found it at last, or near enough, and the addition of a cold wood ash from her own stove was the thing that made it hold 4 parts clay to 2 of sand, to 1 of chopped grass, to 1 of ash. And when that mixture dried, it dried whole, sealing the stone airtight against the breath of the fire beneath. She built the chimney last a vertical clay-lined throat, rising from the exit port of the labyrinth up through the cabin roof sized at 8 inches square. When she fired the system for the first time on a mild evening in late May, Eli sat cross-legged on the floor watching the firebox mouth with an expression of focused solemnity that she recognized as her own face on a younger person. She touched a match to the kindling. For a terrible moment, the smoke hesitated, and she felt the weight of every laughing face in Brennan's cabin, every raised eyebrow, every word she had not been permitted to finish. Then the labyrinth caught. The draft took hold, a low, deliberate pull that drew the smoke into the stone and sent it winding through the channels and up the throat and out into the evening sky without a wisp of it escaping into the room. Eli looked at the firebox and looked at his mother and said the thing she would remember. It works. She put her hand on top of the warm stone and felt the heat rising up through 4 inches of rock, gentle and even, and nothing like the scorching blast of the iron stove. It works, she agreed. She slept on the platform that night, leaving Eli in his bunk, and when she woke 12 hours later, the fire had been ash for most of that time, and the stone beneath her was still warm, reading perhaps 70 degrees against her palm, where a plank bed would have been colder than the room. She lay in the gray dawn light and pressed her hand flat against the rock and thought of Elias in his Virginia hills, pressing his palm to a cooling kiln and saying the things she now understood completely. Not as a lesson, but as a truth she had proved with her own hands in her own stone. She thought of Daniel, who had died in the cold this rock was meant to defeat, and she let herself feel the full weight of that for one long, quiet moment, the grief and the vindication arriving together, the way they sometimes did, inseparable, each the price of the other. Then she got up and started the breakfast fire and went on with the work of staying alive. The fuel savings were as striking as the warmth. That single evening's fire, an eighth of a cord of split aspen, had done what her iron stove could not accomplish, with twice the wood holding heat through the whole night and into the morning without a stick added after she sealed the firebox door. She went to the woodpile and counted what remained, and did a different arithmetic than the one she had been doing all winter. Not the counting down of a woman running short, but the patient calculation of a woman with enough. And the difference between those two kinds of arithmetic was the difference between surviving and living. Through June, she set herself to the cabin's envelope with the same systematic attention she had given the stone mass. The cold had taught her the lessons through Daniel's last winter, and her own first one, that a warm heart and a leaking house was not enough, that every gap in the logs and every loose pane and every breath of cold air moving beneath the floor undid a portion of what the stone stored. She mixed a new chinking, 4 parts blue clay to 2 of sand, and 1 of chopped straw, and 1 of dried cow dung she bought from a neighbor's herd, and she packed it into every gap between the logs until no daylight showed through the walls and no wind found entry around the timber. The work took 3 weeks of long afternoons and left her hands raw and her back aching, and the cabin transformed from a structure that breathed cold into one that held warmth the way a cupped palm holds water. Then came the plaster, the continuous clay skin she pressed across every interior log surface, half an inch thick, smooth as she could make it, the same technique she had seen described in Elias's notes in the context of the old forge houses he had worked on in the mountain valleys of West Virginia. The clay dried to a surface that absorbed heat from the evening fire and released it slowly through the following hours. A second thermal reservoir working alongside the great stone mass, turning the whole cabin into a system of stored warmth rather than a box with one hot point and many cold ones. She worked in sections, waiting 2 full days between them for proper curing, and Eli painted the lower courses while she reached the upper ones, standing on a stool Daniel had made the first summer, and the boy was careful about it in a way that told her he understood this was not ordinary work. The floor she addressed, last stuffing birch bark between the joists as a barrier against the moving cold air beneath, then packing dried grass and pine needles above it in a layer 6 inches thick before relaying the salvaged planks. When she walked across the finished floor in her stocking feet on the first cool morning of July, she stopped in the middle of the room and stood still, feeling the difference. The cold did not come up through the boards. The room held around her like something solid, not the fluctuating country of hot near the stove and cold everywhere else that had been her whole domestic experience in Wyoming. She stood in the middle of her own floor and felt something she recognized after a moment as safety, which she had not felt inside 4 walls since before Daniel died. Summer also exposed the chimney's weakness, which she addressed before autumn, with the same unsentimental efficiency she brought to every problem the building raised. The original throat pulled poorly when the barometer dropped ahead of storms, and on 2 occasions smoke reversed and pushed back into the room, filling it with gray haze, before she threw the door open. She rebuilt the chimney taller, 24 feet above the roofline, and broader 10 by 12 inches inside, and lined it with a smooth clay wash that gave the climbing smoke nothing to snag on and no rough surface where creosote could build. She added a smoke chamber at the base, an expanding vault where the gases from the labyrinth could slow and gather before the chimney's long pull drew them cleanly upward. When she fired the rebuilt system in late August, the smoke went up straight and clean and did not waver even when the afternoon thunderheads rolled their pressure across the valley. She noted the result in Elias's notebook in the margins beside his drawings and added her own measurements and adjustments in her smaller, neater hand. And the notebook that had crossed a continent became a document of two generations working the same problem from either end of time. She spent the autumn selecting and splitting hardwood, the oak and maple and ash that burned clean and hot and left the least residue in her carefully built channels, setting it to season in the open woodshed she built against the east wall of the cabin, with boards salvaged from the collapsed corner of Daniel's barn. 18 months of proper seasoning was the ideal her grandfather had described, and the frontier never practiced. But she had two cords from the previous autumn that had dried through a full summer, and she put those aside for the winter's main burning and split the green wood for the following year. She developed a system of evening fires, one fierce loading of seasoned hardwood burned hot and complete to bright coals before she sealed the door. The batch burning method Elias had described in his notes for the old masonry stoves of the lime burning trade, where a slow, starved fire was the enemy of a clean flue and the friend of creosote in eventual disaster. By the time October turned the aspen groves gold above the valley, Jacob's neighbors had begun to notice a thing they could not explain, that the widow Haywood's chimney gave off almost no smoke. Their own stovepipes trailed gray streamers across the autumn sky through every cooking hour, but her stone throat breathed nearly clean, the fire so complete and its heat so thoroughly wrung into the rock that almost nothing escaped to mark the air. Brennan mentioned it at the settlement store with a laugh that was not quite as easy as his laughs usually were, suggesting she must have given up cooking altogether. And the other men smiled without total conviction. And Mary Curtis, who was standing near the flower bins with her baby on her hip, and 3 months of sleepless, cold worry written into the skin under her eyes, said nothing at all, but looked at the floor with an expression Brennan did not notice. And Cora, hearing the account secondhand, understood precisely. The winter that came in December of 1885 was the one the country had been building toward, the one the old-timers would use as a measuring stick for the rest of their lives. An Arctic mass settled over the Wind River Range and refused to move day after day, compounding into weeks, the mercury fixing at 30 below, and staying there while the wind drove the cold into a cutting thing that found every gap, every crack, every failed seam, and every structure the valley held. Snow piled 4 feet on the level and drifted to 8 against north-facing walls. The cold was not a weather event. It was a siege, and it had been laid against people who had built, almost without exception, for an enemy that had not yet shown its full face. Thomas Brennan's cabin demonstrated first and most completely what happened when the ordinary methods met an extraordinary winter. His iron stove, sufficient for the Decembers he had known, could not hold the room against 30 below, in a wind that found every dried and cracked seam in his log walls. He burned through his winter wood before the middle of January and turned without ceremony to the furniture feeding chair rungs and table legs, and then barn siding and fence rails into the stove, burning his own property by the armload to purchase one more freezing night in a room that never rose above bearing. His family huddled together under every quilt he owned and shook through the dark, and the frost formed on the inside of the walls each morning regardless, and the water barrel 3 feet from the stove froze solid on the worst nights, so that he spent precious fuel melting ice for his children to drink. A vicious circle tightening around a household that had built well enough for a moderate country and found itself in a severe one. The Curtis place told a different kind of failure story. Samuel spent his days repacking the chinking as it fell away under the stress of logs contracting in the sustained cold, pressing frozen mud into gaps that opened faster than his numbed hands could close them. The cold undoing in an hour what he had labored to build through a morning. Inside, the baby's cough had gone into his chest properly now. A wet, ragged sound that Mary tried not to hear in its full implications while she held the child against her body through the nights and watched the frost walk up the walls and understood that the house was making her child sick, and she did not know how to make it stop. Henry Larson's catastrophe came in the deep of a January night, his roof carrying snow that no interior warmth had ever risen to shift or soften, had been accumulating a weight it was not built to bear, and the support beam that gave way announced itself with a crack like a rifle shot in the black hours. A section of roof fell inward, bringing timber and snow and the brutal cold of the open sky down into the cabin, and Larson, who had taken to sleeping near the door out of a rancher's instinct that it was wise to keep your exits clear, got out into the killing cold in his stocking feet and drove himself through the drifts to the Curtis place and beat on the door until Samuel came. He was alive. The cabin was not, and he passed the remaining weeks of the freeze in a neighbor's failing warmth, a man whose house had tried to bury him. Against all of this, Cora Stone held. Her evening routine did not change when the Arctic mass descended. One fierce fire, an eighth of a cord of seasoned oak loaded in the belly of the firebox, and burned to bright coals before she sealed the iron door, and then the 2 tons of rock drank that heat and metered it back across the whole of the following day. While Brennan burned his fences and Larson's roof came down, and the Curtis baby rattled in the cold, damp Cora's woodshed, stood better than half full, her consumption running 70 parts in 100 below the emergency rates at which her neighbors were destroying their homesteads to survive. She woke each morning to a warm stone at her back in a cabin that had given up perhaps 6 degrees through the night, where Brennan's iron stove room swung 20 and 30 degrees between a stoked fire and cold ash. Eli slept on the stone platform every night of the freeze without extra quilts. In a warmth so steady he stopped waking in the cold hours, the way he had every night of his life in that cabin. The great mass revealed in the deep cold a virtue Cora had understood intellectually, but now felt in the fabric of her daily life. The stone's inertia resisted sudden change. When the outside temperature plunged from 0 to 30 below, between dusk and midnight the cabin interior gave up 5 degrees. No more the thermal mass absorbing the shock, the way deep water absorbs a stone, with barely a ripple on the surface. The clay walls worked in the same patient register, soaking the surplus heat of the evening fire and releasing it through the frozen hours so that the room held within 10 degrees of itself across the whole turning of a day, warm enough that her water never froze, and her stored vegetables kept sound in their corners, and the roof above her warmed evenly from within. Let its snow settle and slide in the milder hours, rather than stack into the killing weight that had broken Larson's ridgepole. She noticed too, and this surprised her more than the warmth, that the vicious cold improved her system, rather than taxing it. The greater the gulf between the warmth she maintained and the cold without, the stronger the draft climbed her tall chimney, pulling the fire hotter and extracting a greater share of the heat from the traveling smoke before it escaped. At 30 below, her combustion ran as clean as she had ever seen it, the stone taking nearly everything the fire had to give. The exhaust arriving at the chimney top, spent and cool and almost invisible. The worse the winter raged, the better her machine answered it, as though Elias had built his kilns not merely to withstand the cold, but to use it. And Cora lying warm on her stone, in the worst nights of the worst winter. The valley had known, felt the old mason's satisfaction passing through the rock into her bones like warmth itself. Mary Curtis came to her door in the last days of January with the baby on her hip, and Samuel behind her, and the look of a woman who has been proved wrong about something that mattered, and knows the full cost of having been wrong. She stepped inside and stood for a moment in the warmth that met her at the threshold. Not the scorching blast near an iron stove, but an even ambient heat that pressed gently from every surface, from the plastered walls and the stone mass in the sealed floor. Warmth without source or center, because the whole room had become the source. The baby on her hip stopped his coughing. Mary's face moved through several things that were not quite tears and set itself into something resolved. She laid her hand on the smooth clay wall and felt it giving heat, and she looked at Cora with the full weight of a year's dismissal sitting between them, and the words came out of her quiet and direct. "We were wrong about you. I need you to know I understand that." Cora pulled a chair near the stone and set Mary in it, and put the baby on the warm platform, and within the hour the child was sleeping without the rattle in his chest that had been his constant companion since October, breathing the clean, dry air of a house that did not try to kill the people it sheltered. Samuel came back the next morning alone, hat in hand, to learn. He stood before the stone mass with the expression of a man in the presence of something he had dismissed as foolish, and now saw clearly was not, and the seeing cost him something, and he paid it. "I told half the valley it couldn't work," he said. "I said a woman couldn't build what a mason wouldn't." Cora took the old notebook from its shelf and set it on the table between them, and began to draw the flue channels on a clean page in her own careful hand. It isn't about what a mason would or wouldn't do, Sam. It's about what the stone can do that iron can't. She drew through the morning explaining as she drew, and Curtis asked the right questions and listened without the defensive posture of a man protecting a position because he no longer had a position to protect. Henry Larson came with his bandaged hands wrapped around a borrowed cup and the particular humility of a man whose house has fallen on him and who is therefore done pretending about anything. He sat by the stone and said very little for a long time, and then said the thing that came from somewhere below his ordinary talking. I've built 40 years of houses I meant to leave, and every one of them was as ready to leave me as I was to leave it. He meant to rebuild. He was 65 years old with a broken roof behind him, and he meant to build one last house in stone, and there was something in the way he said it, a man arriving late at permanence, that moved Cora in a way the younger men's conversions had not quite reached. Brennan came last, which was fitting, having laughed first. He came on a February afternoon when his face had shed the red bluster that was its ordinary weather and gone pale and drawn with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He stood in Cora's doorway, which she had opened to him without expression, and he looked at the warm room and the stone mass and the child sleeping peacefully on the warm platform. And he looked at the woman who had built it while he was riding past her yard and grinning at the rock pile. His 3 children were in a house he was actively dismantling to keep them alive. He had burned through every reserve he had, and some he had not technically owned. The grin was gone, and something rawer had taken its place, something that it cost him to show a woman he had publicly dismissed. And Cora could see what it cost him, and she did not make him pay more than was fair. He said, I have 3 young ones who are going to freeze if I don't learn what you know, and I was wrong to laugh, and I am asking you. She stepped back from the door and let him in, and said the thing that closed the long account between them cleanly. Sit by the stone first, Thomas. Get warm. Nobody learns anything while they're shaking. He sat, and the cold that had ruled the valley met in that cabin the first thing all winter it could not break. Brennan came back 3 more times that February, and each time he came, he listened more carefully and asked better questions, and she gave him everything, the mortar recipes in Elias's hand and her own, the channel dimensions, the chimney arithmetic, the fuel management, the envelope sealing, all of it laid out on the pages of a notebook that had started as one old man's working record and become something larger. She had not expected to feel what she felt in those sessions, the strange, deep satisfaction of knowledge that had passed from Elias to her, finding its way outward into the valley where it was needed, a warmth propagating through understanding. The way the stone propagated warmth through mass slowly and evenly and in every direction at once. The freeze broke in the first days of March, the mercury climbing at last toward a range where a man or a woman could stand outside without the cold, reaching for their life. The drifts began their slow surrender along the south slopes. The creek groaned under its ice and began to run in dark threads along the edges, and the valley exhaled a breath it had been holding since December. 3 new cabins would go up that spring using Cora's design, each adapted to its builder's ground and materials. The stone mass and the sealed envelope becoming not a widow's eccentric project, but the plain good sense of a community that had been taught by the hardest possible teacher what this country required of the people who wanted to stay in it. The territorial paper in Cheyenne ran a short piece about the stone heating methods being tried in the mountain homesteads, thin on detail, as newspapers often were about things they did not quite understand. But it was enough to bring inquiries to the settlement store about clayworking tools and proper mortar from settlers in other valleys who had heard the account from the supply wagon drivers who had seen the difference with their own eyes. The fool's project, the widow's waste of effort, was becoming the thing the valley measured itself against, and it had happened without argument, without a raised voice, without anything except the simple fact of one warm cabin standing in the middle of a winter that had broken every other. Cora stood in her doorway on the first morning of the real thaw and watched the water run from her eaves in the early sun, and she let herself hold the fullness of what the winter had been. She thought of Daniel, who had died in the cold the stone now defeated. And she thought of Eli, who had slept warm on that stone through every night of the worst freeze in the valley's memory. And she thought of Elias pressing his palm to a warm kiln in the Virginia hills and telling a girl what stone could do if you gave it enough and let it work. She pressed her own palm flat against the stone now, and felt the last of the night's warmth still resident in the rock, fading slowly toward the temperature of the room. And she understood that this was what permanence felt like. Not the permanence of any one fire, or any one winter, or even any one life, but the deeper permanence of knowledge that passed from hand to hand and kept people warm long after the hands that first held it had gone still. She had set out to keep her son alive through a Wyoming winter. She had built something that would keep people alive through Wyoming winters long after she was gone, and the stone that remembered heat would go on, remembering it generation after patient generation, exactly as her grandfather had promised.